Hey all, welcome back to my channel. If you haven't been here before, my name is Julie and I mostly make content surrounding topics such as music, makeup, as well as mental health. Today's video is mental health related, of course, as it is part of my Let's Get Clinical series in which I educate the public on mental health conditions in regard to their symptoms, prevalence rates, as well as potential treatment options. So for today's video, I decided, since I recently did a video on generalized anxiety disorder and I also talked about social anxiety, that I would cover depression. Now, there are multiple depressive disorders delineated in the DSM, but one of the most well-known depressive disorders I would feel is major depressive disorder. So for today's video, we're going to talk about the symptoms, prevalence, and treatment of major depressive disorder. So let's get into it. According to the DSM, we have some delineated diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. If you haven't watched my series before, this is the DSM. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was published by the American Psychological Association in 2013. So we may need an update. However, this is what I'm going on for today's video. And this is the book that clinicians and psychologists alike utilize when diagnosing clients with a mental health condition, depending on where they are practicing. I live in the United States, so that's what we use. According to the DSM, you need to have 5 or more out of 9 possible symptoms, and the following symptoms have to have been present consistently for a 2-week time period, and they have to represent a change from one's previous level of functioning. At least one of the symptoms must be either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. So now I'm going to go through the 9 symptoms of major depressive disorder, and then afterward I'll get into more detail about what those mean for those of you who may not have a clinical background and are the average viewer. Symptom 1 entails that a depressed mood must occur for most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either subjective reports, so the client expresses they feel sad, empty, or hopeless, or it could be observations made by others, such as that the individual appears to be tearful, even though they are not stating that they feel down, low, etc. There's an important note here that depressed mood may look different in children or adolescents, and it may actually present as irritability. Symptom 2 delineates that the individual must have markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. And again, this can be self-reported or it could be others making this observation. Symptom 3 entails significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain. Typically, this is showcased as a change of more than 5% of body weight in a month's time period. It can also persist as a decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. Potentially in children, it may entail that they are expected to gain weight in their development and they are unable to do so due to their depression symptoms that are affecting appetite. Symptom 4 is insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day. Symptom 5 is psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day. And it must be to the point that it's observable by others and isn't just merely subjective reported feelings of restlessness or being slowed down. Symptom 6 has to do with fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Symptom 7 pertains to feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, which the guilt may be delusional and it has to occur nearly every day. So it can't merely be someone feeling guilty about being sick, which is something normal to feel guilty about. It has to be guilt that seems too emotionally extreme to match the rationale of the situation. So that is up to clinician interpretation, of course. Moving into symptom 8, we have diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. This particular symptom can be reported directly from the client, and it also can be an observation made by the clinician or other people in the individual's life. And the last symptom is recurrent thoughts of death. So not just a fear of dying. This is true recurrent suicidal ideation. The suicidal ideation may occur without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt or specific plan for committing suicide may occur in the individual. So those are the 9 main symptoms, and then we have other requirements prior to making the diagnosis. Are you ready for this one? The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So this is mentioned in almost every video because the mental health condition, of course, has to affect your functioning in some aspect, whether it's your social life, work life, etc. As clinicians, we need to make sure that the episode is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or to another medical condition. Not to say that someone with a substance use disorder or medical condition may comorbidly also experience major depressive disorder. We just have to determine whether it's something that is happening along with what they're experiencing and isn't actually a direct result of what they are experiencing, if that makes sense. We also have an important note here that I found fascinating that was about grief. And when someone experiences a loss, a lot of the time it may seem like they're depressed, and they very well could be. But we can actually rule out a depression diagnosis when someone experiences loss if the symptoms they're experiencing are more so related to the loss and less intrinsic, like symptoms about their self-esteem and self-worth and how they feel about themselves. Because remember, one of the major symptoms of major depressive disorder is a negative self-evaluation. Lastly, we have to rule out that the client or individual has never experienced a manic or hypomanic episode, because then they would qualify for a bipolar disorder diagnosis. Typically, depression is referred to as unipolar depression, whereas bipolar disorder is bipolar depression, because depressive episodes, of course, obviously exist within bipolar disorder, along with either mania or hypomania. Now that I've briefly gone over the 9 possible symptoms that can occur in major depressive disorder according to the DSM, I'm moving forward into diagnostic features. The diagnostic feature section of the DSM just gives us some more details about these symptoms so we can better understand them, as well as other considerations to make for diagnosis. Here we have that the symptoms of depression must be present nearly every day, with the exception of weight change or suicidal ideation. The depressed mood must be present for most of the day, every day, in order for someone to qualify for this specific diagnosis. And the symptoms they're experiencing must be newly present, or the symptoms must have clearly worsened compared with their status pre-depressive episode. Moving forward into describing those previous symptoms I listed in a bit more detail, depressed mood may be described by clients as feeling depressed, sad, hopeless, discouraged, or even down in the dumps. Others may report feeling blah, anxious, or experiencing no feelings, but a depressed mood can still be picked up on by the clinician from facial expression as well as overall demeanor. Depressed mood may also present through somatic complaints like body aches and pains, and is important to consider when working with individuals from various cultural backgrounds. Increased irritability is also a common factor in depression in adults. It may present like persistent anger, angry outbursts in response to events or blaming others, an exaggerated sense of frustration over minor matters, whereas in children and adolescents, it can present with an irritable or cranky mood. However, I know they're taking development into consideration, but the trauma-informed provider in me is taking the inner child into consideration, and boy, do I get irritable and cranky just like a kid. So you're not alone if you relate to the irritability that a child experiences when you feel down. I think that is very valid, and I would take that into consideration personally. Moving forward into Criterion B, which pertain to loss of interest or pleasure in activities. This is also clinically referred to as anhedonia specifically, but it's represented when individuals are less interested in their hobbies and they claim to not care anymore, or they do the activities anyway, but they don't tend to find enjoyment in them despite continuing to do them. For a lot of individuals, this may look like a social, extroverted individual becoming more socially withdrawn. In regard to appetite change, they express that this may look like individuals having no appetite or a low appetite and having to force themselves to eat while depressed, or those who eat more while depressed and are craving specific foods as well. So that can vary for the individual too. And again, you don't particularly need to qualify for that symptom for the diagnosis as long as you do have 5 of them, and 2 of them are the loss of pleasure or interest and the depressed mood. Moving forward into the insomnia or hypersomnia, those are clinical terms for difficulty sleeping or sleeping excessively. Now, when I was talking about the psychomotor agitation, that is a whole mouthful, but agitation is what it sounds like. It's sort of physical anxiety symptoms. Hey, what's up? That's what I'm doing right now, right? So these include the inability to sit still, pacing, hand-wringing, or pulling or rubbing of the skin, clothing, as well as possibly other objects. Now, the term retardation has to do with slowed speech, thinking, and body movements, and also increased pauses before answering, along with speech that is decreased in volume, inflection, amount, or a variety of content or muteness. Now, the psychomotor agitation, as I previously mentioned, it can't be self-report from the client. Other people have to notice it. The clinician has to notice it. It has to be at a point where it's not this intrinsic experience, which to me is still very valid. I want to say, just validate that. I'm just speaking on the DSM requirements. In regard to Criterion 7, which pertains to this sense of worthlessness or guilt that people experience within major depression, it's important to rule out if these negative evaluations of one's worth are realistic or unrealistic, along with these guilty preoccupations or ruminations over minor past failings. The key word is a past failing may be minor, but is the guilt someone is experiencing over it excessive, or does it appropriately match the situation? Lastly, we have concentration difficulties in children, specifically could present through their grades dropping. In the elderly, this symptom could present through memory issues that mimic the early signs of dementia, and the way to rule out if it's actually dementia would be to engage that elderly client in depression treatment for a period of time, and if their memory issues improved, then it wasn't. However, they can be interrelated, of course, too. The development and course section of the DSM speaks about these aspects in regard to various mental health conditions. In regard to major depressive disorder, the average onset in the United States of major depressive disorder typically peaks around the 20s, but the likelihood of onset increases with puberty. However, this diagnosis can be given to any individual, regardless of age. So children, adolescents, adults, and even the elderly. The most important piece is treatment considerations, and that treatment may look different for these populations due to developmental considerations, but we'll get into that in a moment. We have risk factors, which I think is important to mention here for depression. So in regard to temperament, we have neuroticism, which is someone whose personality, they have a negative affectivity in it. Typically, I think of this as someone who is a very anxious person. Environmentally, the DSM speaks on adverse childhood experiences putting individuals at a higher risk of developing depression, which is very important because adverse childhood experiences are tied to complex PTSD as well, which is not in the DSM. But moving forward, genetically, first-degree family members of individuals with major depressive disorder have a risk of development 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. And heritability is approximately 40%, and it's such a high percentage, especially if the person has that temperament of neuroticism. Now, I did mention this briefly previously in regard to somatic symptoms within depression, but it is important as a culturally competent provider that if someone is coming to you from a various cultural background and they are not speaking on depression in regard to thoughts and feelings, but they're reporting a lot of bodily aches and pains, and it's been ruled out that they don't have a medical condition that is causing this, this is very valid, and this is how depression often can present itself in other cultural populations. So it's definitely important to consider for diagnosis. Beyond this, when it comes to major depressive disorder, there is a really high risk for suicide to the point that it is listed in the DSM, and it is even higher of a risk for individuals who have borderline personality disorder and also have this diagnosis. Oh wait, that's me. I'm okay, guys. I'm okay, but it's really important to mention that as well. In regard to comorbidity, comorbid mental health conditions along with major depressive disorder tend to be substance use disorders, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, as well as borderline personality disorder. And lastly, in regard to talking about symptoms, Functioning may differ, and this is important to mention as well. This impairment in functioning for individuals with major depression may be mild, while others may really struggle and find themselves unable to attend to their basic self-care needs, and others can even come across as mute or catatonic because of that symptom of either psychomotor agitation or retardation, which your human here's got the psychomotor agitation covered, trust me. But anyway, let's move forward into prevalence, shall we? The prevalence rate for major depressive disorder in the United States is approximately 7%, with marked differences by age group, such that the prevalence in 18 to 29-year-old individuals is threefold higher than the prevalence in individuals ages 60 or older. With gender differences taken into account, females experience 1.5 to threefold higher rates than males beginning in early adolescence. I also looked at a resource that estimated lifetime prevalence because the 7% prevalence is over a 12-month period collected from data. The 12% prevalence is the lifetime prevalence in the United States. That is very high and very concerning. But let's move forward into treatment options, since this is very concerning, right? Because we want to help people. I, as a provider, want to help people, and I wanted to know what is out there. What should I be looking at for people? So the ADAA is a wonderful resource, and they have practical guidelines for evidence-based treatments of various mental health conditions. So they note that first-line treatments for adults with major depressive disorder are CBT, which I'm going to say in probably almost every video, it's good for most mental health conditions. It's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's where we challenge our distorted thought patterns and negative evaluations / beliefs about ourselves and start to have more rational and realistic thoughts, which is theorized to help diminish the intensity of some of our emotions and help us with certain self-destructive or unhealthy behaviors. The CBT is typically short-term and is about 20 sessions long and tends to be problem-focused. Beyond that, we also have interpersonal therapy, which for depression would address social issues that maintain the depression, and this may take place in the form of either individual or group counseling. Lastly, for adults, we have problem-solving therapy, which teaches us to define personal problems, develop multiple solutions, identify the best one, and implement it, and assess whether it was effective or not, which is very interesting. So next up, they talk about children and adolescents with depression, and CBT and IPT appear to be helpful for this population as well, most effectively for youth ages 12 to 18. But beyond that, and I love this, I totally agree with this, it says that supportive therapy holds efficacy in which the clinician utilizes clinical skills such as active listening and reflection, restoration of hope, problem solving, coping skills, and strategies for maintaining participation in treatment, psychoeducation, which is this video, we're doing it now, as well as family and school involvement, which is very important when working with youth, that everyone collaborates together to help the youth. The last population that is important to consider is in regard to geriatric depression. So for individuals who are elderly, who are experiencing depression, there is some evidence to CBT, behavioral therapy, cognitive bibliotherapy, problem-solving therapy, brief psychodynamic therapy, as well as reminiscence therapy. Before I get into medications, I didn't see TMS anywhere. And I want to tell y'all, I have this diagnosis. The thing that helped me the most with it was TMS, and I know so many people who feel the same way. If you want to know more about TMS, I will link my video down below because I did speak on my experience. I was also on a podcast with the organization where I did TMS, so I'll link that for y'all too because they're getting bigger and bigger and they have the best patient care in the whole world. So I say, if you want to consider something, consider TMS. It is an evidence-based treatment for major depressive disorder as well as a couple of other mental health conditions now, and beyond that, it's very minimally invasive and has minimal side effects. And ECT is really just a last resort for treatment-resistant depression. It can help people, but it has a lot of side effects. Whereas TMS, the worst that happens is you commit your time to getting that treatment and it doesn't work out, but you get great patient care if you go to Achieve. So it's worth it. But let me wrap up here with the final first-line treatments with evidence-based to them, and that would be psychiatric medications. Now, I respect that this is a personal choice and medication's not for everyone, whereas some people need it or want to take it and it is life-changing for them, and that is very important to respect. So in regard to adults, antidepressants have the highest efficacy in treating major depressive disorder. The first that are utilized are typically in the class of SSRIs or SNRIs. Bupropion as well as mirtazapine seem to help these individuals as well. In regard to children and adolescents, Prozac seems to be the most helpful medication for children and adolescents according to research, and it is actually the only FDA-approved medication for major depressive disorder for children who are not yet adolescents, so they are pre-adolescents. The elderly can benefit from medication too, and you can provide them with similar dosages and medication options to adults, but you have to go up on the medication really slowly with them and be very careful because developmentally they are elderly, and this is important to take into consideration to keep everyone safe. Okay, well, beyond that, I'm gonna say if you're depressed, you should do a little bit of DBT too, because I think DBT is great, and I'd love to talk about that on my channel more as well. But thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it. I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel as well. You can follow me on my social media down below. There's just one now. My Instagram's Julie_counseling. My Facebook page will be linked in the description box down below, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye, all.